Hi, welcome. Welcome to episode 2 of Girl Gone Viral. I hope you all enjoyed last week's episode with Jessica Lagnato. If you haven't heard it, please give it a listen after you hear this one. I'm so excited to have Catherine Connors on today. Catherine spent a lot of her career working at Disney, specifically the women and family portfolio, but also around how little girls and boys responded to princesses. So this episode focuses around the implicit and explicit messages we hear in this film and TV and the stories that we tell ourselves and how those translate working in tech and meme culture. She is the co-founder and CCO of Maverick, a network for girls and young women. She's the former editor-in-chief of Babbel and former head of content for Disney Interactive's Women and Family portfolio. Catherine has been featured in media like the New York Times, CNN, NPR, Good Morning America, and she's also one of Clubhouse's creators in their creator program. She was one of the first creators on Clubhouse for them to recognize and say, hey, we want to pay you to create content. We love your conversation. I grew up watching Disney. I love the princesses. And so this episode just made my mind explode, and I hope it does for you too. So here's the episode, and I'm so excited for you to hear us. Bye. I'm so excited to be doing this with you.
Me too.
You're part of my first, 9 interviews that I have so far, and I'm going to be editing them and then releasing them all in February together as like a batch.
That's exciting.
So I'm so excited to have you. The title of the podcast, Girl Gone Viral, is from my time running Girl. And I know that your daughter followed Girl and all of your work with young girls. And so I'm going to kind of position a lot of my questions based off of what I know, which works with young girls. But if I'm off, feel free to correct me. I was actually shocked with a lot of the performance about girls. When I was posting, I was shocked because you wouldn't think that there was the themes that girls pick up on, and some of the themes that you talk about is so true. And I would have never known that without running the page myself, how sad.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, totally. I would love to hear so much more about that. When we built Maverick, we had this big community of girls that it was getting the back channel from the girls was just an extraordinary learning experience, both in terms of getting a sense of just how smart and attentive they are to what the culture is doing to them, and also the sadness, right, and the anxiety and the fear. It's
I feel when I look at you, I'm she must talk to herself nicely.
It's interesting because I have a very loud inner critic, most human beings that were raised female. It's hard to not have a loud inner critic. But honestly, I credit my parents. I mean, I was fortunate to have parents who were really thoughtful about how they were raising me and my sister. And so they said and did all the right things. They were sort of ahead of their time in terms of girl power, right? But it wasn't that. It was that the way my parents cared for me was in a fashion where I always knew that they loved me, right? I always knew that I had their care, I had their nurture, but I also knew that they liked me.
Yeah, that burden of even just being likable, as a woman. Are you likable enough? Are you nice enough? Are you quiet enough? All these messages of, can you just be nice and quiet enough to for everybody else to then chase their dreams.
But we are socialized to see our social currency as consisting in being likable. And that includes being nice, being cooperative, all these things. But there's a difference between feeling liked, right, of valuing being liked, and feeling like you need to be likable. And that's the difference. When I say I was raised to believe that I deserved my seat at the table, right, that I had things to say that were worth listening to, that kind of liking, of feeling that my parents liked me in that way, that they appreciated what I had to say, that they wanted to hear my point of view, that was a very different dynamic than the dynamics that tie into feeling like you need to be likable. Because usually those are things around, well, I need to be cooperative. I need to tell people what they want to hear, right? I need to give the right answer. And it's that kind of socialization. I've got, a double heaping of it because I'm also Canadian. So I get that I'm supposed to say sorry for everything and apologize and be super polite. But that pressure to see and understand our social currency as really being about how cooperative we are, which translates in many respects into how passive we are, how compliant we are, all of which we know has just extraordinarily negative implications for girls in many cases. That's the dark side of likability.
The dark side of likability. I love that. You've had a long and very impressive and one of the most interesting careers that I've ever come across, including as head of content for Disney Interactive's Women and Family portfolio. In one of your interviews, you write, while at Disney, I became deeply invested to finding opportunities for the company to support girls, especially pre-adolescent and adolescent girls, confronting a, quote, confidence gap, or as you reframed it, the dream gap.
Yeah, wow. So the whole Disney story, there's a lot to go into there, but let's start with the confidence gap and the dream gap. So I think most people have heard the term confidence gap. We certainly have talked a lot about girls' confidence and the dynamics whereby they lose their confidence or they don't gain confidence. There's a really amazing scholar called Carol Gilligan who wrote about it a lot in the 70s and 80s. One of her graduate students, Lynn Michael Brown, became an advisor to my last company and is a friend. She co-wrote a book called Meeting at the Crossroads with Carol Gilligan, and they frame it as loss of voice, right? So they point to the moment when girls lose what a power that they already have, which is to speak up, which is to be creative, which is to be assertive, right? So it's not that girls never gain confidence or never gain a voice. It's that they have it. Like all children, most people have seen children in the wild, know that they have very loud voices, loads of creativity, but they start to lose it. So the gap is this very real social space in which girls start to fall when they start receiving social messages about their place in the world. I started reframing it as a dream gap at Disney to sort of both think about the implications of loss of voice and to think about the implications of what happens when girls start to fall into the gap. The thing that happens is that they lose the connection to connect what they dream they can do and their faith in their ability to do it. So they still have big dreams. They still can imagine all sorts of extraordinary things, but what happens in the gap is that they start to lose faith in their ability that they could achieve those dreams. So whereas boys tend to, like, they see so many role models in the culture of men doing extraordinary things, so much so that it's not even that we consider men doing extraordinary things an exceptional thing, right? Men just do awesome shit. Right? They jump out of airplanes, they run companies, they code, they build. Most of the things that we're familiar with are associated with stuff that men do, so much that we think of it as the human, right? It's just, that's what human power looks like, is to be masculine. Girls, on the other hand, receive these messages very early and very often, very, very subtly, because they're not seeing women do that stuff. So a girl might, be 5 or 6 years old and imagine that she could build a Walt Disney company, right? She's going to create theme parks and she's going to invent princess stories and she's going to build all these wild and amazing things. But then she starts to receive the very, very subtle social messages that women don't do that. And her dreams fall into that gap. Right. So she may still have this vivid imagination and this vivid sense of how she can contribute to the world. But as she starts to receive those messages, very, very subtle, just through what she sees in media and in the stories and around her, that's not for her to do. That's where the dream gap happens.
I think it's so interesting to hear what our dreams are and how they've changed. Like young girls and what they're told they're able to be when they grow up is like, I feel like for the most part, they look at what are their parents, what do the girls in the TV and movies that they watch in the books and Barbies, what do they do for a living? Like just to understand our options and our toys, really. I remember playing like store clerk when I was when I was like 10. I'd pretend I worked at a grocery store, and then in high school I actually worked at a grocery store. So I don't know what that says about me. As far as modeling who gets to be a hero in our actions, especially in film and TV, it really matters who's making the film and TV and what are their intentions with making the film and TV and what are their biases. The makeup of the people who are making our movies and TV. For example, in 2018, of the top 100 grossing films, 85% of those writers were male. And in a co-lead or lead role, only 11% were women from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group. So I think what a hero looks like on film and TV reflected back to us really starts to matter. And you can see this play out in the stories over generations.
We all know, and this was one of my favorite stories growing up, was the story of Peter Pan and Wendy, but I was always really frustrated by the fact that Wendy has to go back to the real world. Peter Pan gets to stay in Neverland and spend all of his days fighting pirates and doing cool stuff and living in this imaginary, magical, extraordinary world of his own devising. But Wendy has to go back and be a grown-up. And it's always struck me that sort of describes the plight of women and girls, that you can play for a while, right? You can have your moments and your experiments with Neverland, but end of the day, you have to go back to the nursery and take care of everybody else. Right. And we just have to suck that up. I think there's an analog, and we look at, how common it is in tech and in business, for example, for women to be not the CEOs, but the COOs, right? To be head of communications or marketing, to have the sort of housekeepery roles, to have the wife roles, right? The nursery keepers, they're the ones that make sure everything works okay and everybody's fed and all the diapers are changed, literally or figuratively. But the men get to be the Peter Pans who, futz around with all the pixie dust.
Did you feel like at any point in your career that had happened to you where you knew you wanted to go after a certain role, but you couldn't? Like, it certainly happened to me.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I spent sort of the first significant part of my adult life in academia. And academia is this like terrible sexist place. At least in academia, at least as sort of in my corner of it, there's at least more of a semblance of a meritocracy. So if you are smart enough, like it's like you have a fighting chance. It was really, no exaggeration, a shock to me once I'd gotten a year or two into Disney. I came in on an acquisition, so you have that golden halo and everybody wants to listen to you and they think you're a genius. And then once that glow wears off and you're just an ordinary cast member, then you sink into the reality of it. It was really a shock to me that being the smartest person in the room was actually not an advantage. Right? That they didn't want me to be the smartest person in the room at a certain point, that it was threatening to men in the room. I was actually told by a senior HR person that was like probably what my problem was when I was having conflicts with, men at the company. I'm like, the black helicopters are going to come get me for saying this stuff out loud. It was that sense of, oh, right. You want me to, say the nice things. You want me to use the big words. Like there was a version of me that was, in a sense, a kind of comms expert, right? It's like you tell the best story about princesses and you tell the best story about this company's legacy and where it can go. But when it actually comes time to like building the stuff, that's for the big boys, right? That's where the Peter Pans and the Lost Boys get to play. And that for me was this really sobering thing because, and I say this with some shame. I'd known that all the structural inequities were there. I'd known that all the obstacles were there. I knew that the glass ceiling was there, but I also thought that I was special and that it wouldn't apply to me. So when it did start applying to me, then I got mad, right? Which is usually how it happens. Really, really sobering, which was that was when I began to plan my departure from Disney, was when I like really realized like, oh, there's a limit to what I can do here because I'm a lady person.
Can you share what you did at Disney and your experience there?
Yeah, I did a number of things. And my title was head of content, for Disney Interactive. And so my formal role was leading the charge with, and with particular focus on the women and family portfolio, which covered a lot of Disney's digital platforms and tools, for those particular audiences. And that involved working across different divisions within the company around digital strategy. And especially, we didn't call it that then, but a lot of it was what we would now call creator strategy and influencer strategy, and looking at ways to integrate new storytellers into Disney's existing storytelling ecosystem via digital. My side hustle within Disney, the thing that I went in saying, okay, I can't do this unless you let me stir up some shit here, was pushing for some forward movement in women and girls strategy. I actually wanted them to create a women and girls portfolio for looking at, and they placated me for quite a long time, and we sort of had a ad hoc women and girls portfolio. One of the key areas there was rethinking the princess franchise. When I came into Disney on this acquisition, it was after my daughter and Jasper was 3 and Mia was 6. So they were young, and they were just on the cusp of the princess phase. But I'm this former scholar who had given no small amount of talks on the princess industrial complex and the tyranny of commercial fairy tales and girls' moral development. So I came in with a bee in my bonnet about princesses, saying it's I need to still be critical of princesses. And I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to be able to work with some very, very smart people within the company to talk through what it would mean for the company to address women's concerns about how the company represented princesses, not just in marketing and in product, which were had their issues, but also in how we thought about the whole future of Disney's storytelling. So that became my passion project within Disney. And towards in my last year at Disney, I actually shifted from the interactive piece and was focused more or less full time on this women and girls strategy and rethinking princess.
Okay, first of all, holy shit. Your job sounds so cool, but first, what is the Princess Industrial Complex?
The Princess Industrial Complex is the sort of the cultural / economic force of a certain kind of story told to girls and women. My takes on princess have evolved a lot, from when I was an academic through my arc at Disney to now. I grew up, Cinderella was my princess growing up, and not necessarily the Disney Cinderella. I loved the Disney Cinderella. But I spent a lot of time when I was a scholar thinking about how that shapes how we understand what the role of women and girls might be in a public space. So fairy tales, I was always very interested in fairy tales because they're the rare example of where women and girls are at the forefront of a story. Most of the stories that we consider folklore and mythology, certainly religious stories, the heroes are men or boys, right? They're heroes. Fairy tales are one of the few places we see women or girls at the forefront of the story. So I was always very interested in sort of, well, what then do these stories tell us about girls? There's a lot of ways we can parse the oldest versions of these fairy tales. The Disney versions, and most critics of Disney versions of fairy tales will say this, represent, tend to over-index on the romance, on the beauty, on the elements of femininity that many would argue, I certainly did, sort of paint a very narrow picture of what a girl can be.
Like in The Princess and the Frog, where in the Disney version, the princess has to kiss the frog to reverse the spell of the prince. But in the original version, the princess has to throw the frog against a wall. Which is just an incredible metaphor, because as young girls we're told we have to kiss all these frogs, but really we should be throwing them against walls.
Exactly. And so you layer onto that a whole industry, hence the industrial complex, right? It's a riff on military industrial complex. It's there's this massive market for products, for content, for experiences that tracked this very, very specific experience of being a hyper feminine girl or woman.
Fascinating. So princesses are mimetic to young girls. It's crazy because on one hand, you have these storylines like Sleeping Beauty, where she's sleeping until a prince comes and saves the day. And Little Mermaid, she's this whole beautiful voice that she has to give up for a man. Beauty and the Beast, and that storyline, you need to be with him and all his annoying loud furniture. This beast of a man, doesn't matter what he looks like, you have to love him. No way, absolutely not. But on the other hand, they're princess centered, they're female centered, so there's this underlying empowerment. This is her perspective, this is the princess's perspective. So even having that puts the princess in an empowered position because she has a voice there, but it still doesn't feel super empowering.
Yeah, you have to meet them where they are, right? And princesses are a cultural shorthand, right? They're a cultural shorthand to a lot of things, not least because they are these very real and long-standing examples of stories that do center girls and that do center femininity. So there's a lot of really important validating components to them. The problem comes in when we really look at them through that narrow lens and it becomes that framework where a girl comes to believe that's like, well, if I'm not beautiful, then I can't be important, right? Or if I don't find somebody to love me, then I can't be important. I can give you all sorts of arguments about why sort of even the Disney versions of the fairy tales are more nuanced than that. But end of the day, when we think of the mimetic culture of princess, right, it's this shorthand that's this point of entry so that you can say it's like, okay, well, I went through this exercise at Disney. Actually, I wrote TED Talks for 3 of the princesses. It would never let me do this of like, let's film the TED Talk, but part of it was this exercise of like, well, what does lean in sound like if it's actually Cinderella talking about the 3 ways you get to the ball, and how does that shift how we think about what the confidence message could be or the message about getting through the dream gap could be if we start to we start to use the cultural codes and turn them to our advantage.
Right. Moving away from follow your dreams as long as your dreams are chasing a prince. Where do you think this kind of psychosis of someone coming in to save the day and everything is going to be okay comes from? Because like that transcends women, right? Like that is like
Oh my God.
very ingrained.
This is one of my current obsessions. Actually, I spent a fair amount of time. I actually deviated from the book project I was supposed to be working on because I was like, I need to really think about how we disrupt the idea of the hero's journey. Hero's journey has a sort of specific set of meanings, but it's also become the shorthand for what I think of as savior narratives. They are a big part of many of the problems that we're facing because we have this assumption that somebody is always going to come in and save the day. We also, I mean, it's not irrelevant that usually the people we expect to come in and save the day are male, are white, are heterosexual, are able-bodied, are neurotypical, or all these things. Often too, they have like, they've got a lot of scope to be assholes. Tony Stark,
Wealthy. Yeah.
yeah, wealthy, powerful, edgy, like a lot of things that when we think about the human component of like how actual human activity and problem solving really should happen, it's not what we want. But we have this idea that, well, we don't actually have to work together to solve problems because at some point the good guys are going to swoop in. Maybe it's one guy, maybe it's Iron Man, maybe it's the whole team of Avengers. But is this idea that someone's coming to save us? The dark side of that, I mean, I think it has everything to do with the rise of Trump and autocracy as well, right? He's a strong man, right? For a certain subset of the population, he's the superhero, right? To us, that sounds like bonkers and weird, but he's got this strongman narrative, the savior narrative, and people give up their freedom and their, their self-awareness because of this idea that like a hero's coming.
I think I see that with platforms too. I mean, we met originally on Clubhouse, and if you think about in the same way as a hero's journey, but like an artist's journey or the creator's journey, as far as trying to navigate making money off of stories on the internet, there's this sort of thing where it's instead of Trump, it's like the platforms like, okay, now Instagram has this feature, now that's going to fix the day. Twitter has this feature, now that's going to be the big money maker. And it's like an arms race. None of the things are actually benefiting any of the creators at the end of the day. To me, there's a disconnect there, right? So this idea that Instagram and Twitter and other huge content platforms are going to come in and save the day with their monetization tools, and all of a sudden everybody is going to be making money from their content, just isn't going to happen. That just isn't the reality, given that they're getting content for free. Why would they switch this up? Brands are getting their really high value placements for not a lot of money. This is a system that's working for everybody but the creator. And I think it's so true that this coming in to save the day with how it plays out in the press. Like, oh, did you see Twitter is allowing super follows? Oh, did you see you can do tipping on Twitter? Well, actually only some users are allowed to do tipping. So that's not everybody. And we get really caught up in the idea that someday, one time, these money grubbing platforms are going to come in and help me be able to quit my job and earn a living from my tweets. Like, absolutely not. That is not going to happen. I'm sorry.
Totally. No, I love that. No, I think that's a fantastic example, Liz. It's a fantastic example because you're pointing to exactly how that dynamic looks when we start to break it down to how we live our lives and run our businesses and make our money. You're pointing to something really, really important in taking the dynamic of expectations that are set by heroes' journeys and applying them to what we might think is just a very basic sort of area of our lives. We do, and whether one's a creator, at the level of wanting to make money from what one creates, or is just is a quote unquote user or of these platforms. You're absolutely right that we do tend to go into them with the mindset of they're going to solve the problems for us, right? They're going to take care of things. If we don't like how something is going, then we're going to complain and we're going to wait for them to fix it, or we're going to expect them to anticipate what our needs are, right? It's like we expect them to be, the caregivers and the caretakers, and in some ways the autocrats, right? So it's, there's a whole line of conversation we could go down that sort of points to the dangers in that, where we've given up all our power in so many of these platforms and are happily just sort of expecting somebody else to make things right.
Right. And no one's going to. You mentioned a few times, and I want to make sure we talk about this, that you were a professor and you taught a class on the philosophy of happiness. Is that correct?
I did. Yes.
And in the course, you talk about studying the ancient meanings of happiness. Can you tell me a story or something you taught in that class as far as the kind of happiness we struggle with?
I loved teaching that class. So in that class, it was like political theory 340 or something. So it was a upper undergraduate political philosophy class. And we always started with Aristotle, because Aristotle goes on at considerable length trying to understand what we might call human flourishing. So he takes happiness in an interesting direction. It's one that's influenced a lot of how we think, but he distinguishes between pleasure and happiness. Happiness, like kind of meaningful, robust happiness, he refers to as, the ancient Greek word is eudaimonia, which means happy spirit or well in spirit. So it is not necessarily to have a pleasurable life or to be experiencing a lot of pleasure. It's to have one's spirit in a good state. And he, being an ancient philosopher, was pretty adamant that philosophy had a lot to do with this form of happiness, like to pursue wisdom. He talked a lot about friendship as like of rich friendship as conducing to this form of happiness. But for him, it was very important that it was something different from pleasure, which is just this fleeting thing that anybody can experience. It's the difference between like dopamine and serotonin, right? It's like the quick hits of pleasure that we get, we mistake for happiness. We think the things that give us pleasure make us happy. Aristotle's point was always like, no, it's deeper things. So sometimes pain and grief ends up having more to do with how happy we are. He also sort of famously said that you can't really know that you have had a happy life until the end of your life, that you have to take the full stock of it. Did you learn? Did you have rich friendships? Did you progress and grow as a human being? It's not like, what's the quantitative measure of how much pleasure you experienced? It's like, how well did you live your life? How well did you cultivate your spirit?
When you were doing your study on, especially the adolescent girls, maybe 7, 8 to 12, what did you notice about some of the friendships that they were forming and what they were looking for in the friend groups that they had?
Well, in doing research like directly with girls, that came like after my career as an academic, and it really started in working with Disney, where we did do a lot of sort of market oriented research and product development research, and very big, well funded research and analytics teams across all the divisions at Disney. But one of the things that we spent time on was looking at like how do girls and boys, respond to princesses? Like, how do they play, right? What do they think about? What do they respond to in terms of stories? One of the things I learned through the course of that work that was always that has stayed with me is that girls and boys, there aren't a lot of really substantive differences. There's so much that just gets socialized into them. So it's interesting to look at, say, 5 or 6-year-old girls and boys and see, for example, that boys love princesses too, right? My son certainly did. My son probably loved the princess costumes more than Amelia did. When they were engaging in play around, say, Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty or The Little Mermaid, their objective wasn't to put themselves in that role. It wasn't to become Cinderella or to become Belle or to become Ariel. It was actually to move into that life world, right? It was actually to move into that fantasy space and to see, and I certainly saw this with my own kids as much as I saw it in the research groups, that some of the most interesting and fascinating stuff would come out of these kids going into these spaces and being, well, like, I'm going to be Ariel's best friend and this is going to be my name and I'm going to have these powers and I'm going to be able to do this. The way they experienced story was as this vast experiential space that they could just play with themselves. We saw this, by the way, at Disney with Club Penguin, which was I've been arguing recently that this was like a very early, powerful version of the metaverse. It was just this whole world where kids could become penguins and they could build their igloos and they could like buy clothes and play games and meet up. It was a immersive social space, right? So what I would argue is a sort of early metaversal space in which kids just played together virtually. And we saw the same thing there that we would see when, in research around princesses and the sort of product development around, the fairy tales, was that kids like really, really, really got creative, like really, really, really inventive. What they responded so powerfully to is this permission to move into a space and to be builders, to be creators, to be leaders, to be citizens. There was this amazing program that the Club Penguin team ran called Coins for Change, where kids would actually they would generate transactions within the Club Penguin world, and the Walt Disney Company would match and turn them into donations for social causes. So they're like raising money for nonprofits. They're starting like businesses. They're decorating their homes. Like it was really, really wild to see just, and of course, anybody who's seen kids even just play in a yard can see the seeds of that, but to see just how much creativity, how much creative energy they would bring to an immersive story space, I just found really fascinating. And I also have always thought it's such a missed opportunity for us to pay attention to what kids can teach us about imagination and curiosity as it applies to innovation and building.
What are some things that you've recently seen that kids can teach us?
I had never really thought as deeply about the fact that at the core of most Western literature, everything, the stuff you learn in high school and in English lit classes, is that the fundamental basis of most stories is man versus nature, man versus man versus himself. What happens if we take away the conflict as the driving element of the story? It doesn't mean that there aren't frictions in the story. It doesn't mean that there aren't, catalyzing events. What it means is that you're thinking about, do we really need to be me versus you, right? Or me versus a bad guy? And, it just sort of opened up this whole avenue of thinking about, well, what makes that person on the other side of the verses the bad guy? What makes somebody a protagonist or an antagonist? What makes some person a hero and another person a villain? And it became this really, really interesting way of going, okay, I've had all these assumptions, even though I think I'm this super deep thinker about story and storytelling. There were sort of all these deeply ingrained assumptions, even in thinking about the more girl-centered stories that have more centering of women and girls and non-binary experiences. Here was this nub of the verses that was still always there. So one of the things I started to do when I was doing workshops on storytelling was go into the exercise of like, let's take out the verses and let's go through the exercise of using a fairy tale structure and taking out the villain, or take the character that you think is the villain and make them the hero and see how that changes, and then start to look at the differences between the ways that these story dynamics go when you take away antagonism.
The shows on television that I grew up watching, or that a lot of people even watch now, such as Everybody Loves Raymond or Succession, where the conversation around the house and the storylines is all around the emotional health of the dad. Like, what is the dad feeling? What is the dad going to do? What is the dad thinking? And that structure is also pervasive even in our political system, right? When Trump was president, it was like, what is he going to say? And Twitter would go off based off of what he said. And usually a lot of it was pretty emotionally charged. And that TV personality president really is played out in the storylines that dominate American television for the most part. So I love the idea of kind of pushing back and seeing like, okay, what if this show doesn't revolve around the emotional health of the dad? How successful can it be? Who's going to resonate? Because we've seen this story time and time again, and it's getting old. It's getting old, and I can't wait for the creation of new stories that center new heroes, because the entire time I'm watching Succession, I'm like, why is everybody just so focused on what the dad is feeling and not themselves? And that's how a lot of kids grew up, I think, in their household, where it was always about, well, what is the dad going to say? What's dad going to do? Wait till your dad gets home. Experiences that people probably resonate from their childhood, other than being an awesome show and beautiful writing and actors. But beyond that, just lifting up into the deeper meaning of storytelling. That's what I see.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. I mean, story is one of the things that's most fundamental to our lives, right? We're all storytellers. I'll bring in Aristotle again. Man is a political animal, right? Or humans are political animals. He didn't mean that we are inclined to do politics. What he meant was that we're meaning making, like we come together to figure things out, right? And I've always thought of like that fundamental political activity, that activity of coming together, is storytelling. Whether it's you and I doing this, having a conversation, and we're sort of giving shape to ideas through this conversation, or it's kids talking about conflict and trying to parse conflict. Those are all forms of storytelling. Now we have all these structures in which we put certain types of stories: fiction, movies, radio plays, theater, poetry. At the end of the day, what we do as human beings is we tell stories, not just to each other, but with each other. And so when we start to think of it as this fundamental tool that we have, right, this thing that we do naturally, we can think about, well, how do we use that to understand things more deeply, to understand each other more differently? How do we play with our inherent storytelling ability and story making ability to empathize with each other, to imagine together, to be better humans together? Very, very good example of how subtly cultural messages creep in. We've got so many examples of TV shows where like the dad is absolutely the center of the universe, right? As part of the plot, right? Succession is a really good current one, but most sitcoms have oriented around the dad as the center of the universe in some way. But even in shows where ostensibly, the main character has more is a woman and has more agency, even then the dad is still drawing, like the dad is still the authority figure. You think of Roseanne, right? In the the early version of Roseanne, not the rebooted version of Roseanne, and before Roseanne herself went a little bit off the rails. Like there's a central character, but the character of Dan was like, that was the gravitas of the show, right? In so many ways, like the male characters are like they're the core of it in this important way. They're where everybody is looking. They're, end of the day, they're the ones who have the power, either in explicit ways or implicit ways, even where they're the ones that everybody laughs at, right? Whether it's Homer Simpson or the stereotypical, like, squidgy, overweight, comic relief dad. It's still the guy who's getting the laughs. It's still where your eyes and ears go. And that's a big piece of where we start to see it. It's like when you see a dad figure, or a figure that's taking on that paternalistic role in the culture, it seems right to us. It seems like, okay, so he doesn't know how to use his words, and he blusters, and he says, politically incorrect things, but he's confident, and he is asserting his authority, and that feels familiar to us, right? And stuff that feels familiar just often then translates into feeling comfortable, right? And feeling like, well, maybe that's the way it should be.
Mm. And when things feel familiar, they're normalized. And part of the point I want to make to people listening is the storylines in the movies we're discussing here. It's not just like a Disney thing. This is something all networks, all TV, all film. And we were talking about earlier this sort of Prince Charming coming in to save the day. But when that happens in Disney movies, right, the movie ends. So when the prince finally comes to see Sleeping Beauty, it's like, okay, they live happily ever after. This whole coming to save the day, we can see that play out in other movies. One of my favorites, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and this golden ticket. Someone somewhere is going to hand you a golden ticket opportunity, and your life is going to change. With Willy Wonka is specifically the character of Augustus Gloop. And to me, Augustus Gloop has always been a familiar storyline, especially working in tech. And the difference here is, obviously, Augustus isn't a princess. He's a snotty rich boy, which we'll get into. But the difference here is, in those types of stories, in Willy Wonka, when the golden ticket comes in to save the day, the story just begins. And in the case of Augustus, you get to watch what happens when someone with privilege is trying to amass more privilege and how crazy that looks. So for background, just to remind everybody in case it's been a while. Now, Augustus was the rich, chubby boy who drowned in the chocolate river really early on in the movie because he wanted to eat all the candy. Augustus had the most. He was rich, snotty, spoiled. The kid with the most let his wants get in the way of missing the entire journey. Augustus was so concerned with what he could get out of the situation of being in Willy Wonka's candy shop, he didn't realize he was sitting on a pot of gold. He was operating from a scarcity mindset of, I need to drink all of this candy. I need to have all of the things. I need to have more than all of the other kids. He's this archetype of a really easy trap to fall into, which is like, wait, I thought you had everything. I thought you could eat all the candy that you want anytime. Why are you acting like this is the first chocolate you've ever tasted? Comparing himself to making sure that he got more than all of the other kids because that's what gave him power. And he couldn't have enough of it. This archetype of person that has everything, is lucky, but is still measuring themselves against their peers. You know, working at a tech company, you just feel lucky to be there. But you look, so you're like, okay, if you're working at a tech company, especially, 5-10 years ago, when it was harder to get a job at Google than it was to get into Harvard or whatever those statistics were, you feel special, you feel smarter than everyone, and you're sitting alongside with other people who have gotten this golden ticket at this tech company, and all you're trying to do is like make sure you don't become a chocolate river in the way of Augustus's like growth mindset or whatever. I just don't want to become caught in the crossfire of someone operating from a scarcity mindset. And I'm sure people can relate to this in different industries. This is not just related to tech. I see this everywhere. There's this jealousy in being inspired. Like before you get inspired, you get jealous by somebody. And I don't know if you've ever, had a creative block or read The Artist's Way. One of the lessons from that book is if I'm scrolling Twitter and I see somebody launch something or launched a podcast, I'm like, why would they do that? Like there's like a little jealousy, like, how did they get that? Why don't I have that? And that's the step before being inspired. And the only difference between being jealous and being inspired by someone is how much you love yourself.
That's such a great story to look at. The core crisis, in that, like in the Augustus Gloop example, is that despite all of the abundance and all of the privilege that he has, he's still living with a scarcity mindset, or he's creation on a scarcity mindset, because even though it's like flying in the face of reality, it's still that sense that there is never enough to feel secure, right? Or to feel that you've had enough. This goes back to Aristotle's understanding of happiness, right? That if pleasure is your metric, it's never going to be enough because pleasure just comes and goes, right? The defining component of pleasure is that it's like it's finite, right? It doesn't enrich anything. You eat the cookie, and then, when the sweetness of the chocolate chips is out of your mouth, then you're like, well, I might be full, but I want more of that sweetness. I'm chasing that particular dragon again and again. Late stage Eurocentric patriarchal capitalism is that the dynamic of the hero story is that you are always winning, right? That you are always on top, that you are always the main character. And so all of the rewards need to consistently come to you, or you're going to feel like it's like, if you're the actor on the stage and the light goes away from you, it's like, well, have I disappeared? Like there's this existential crisis, I think, that we have around this idea that if we're not winning, if we're not heroes, if we're not winners, if we're not potential saviors, if we're not extraordinary, then somehow we don't matter, right? I think it's that kind of it's a kind of existential or emotional spiritual scarcity that we're experiencing that makes us think, well, I'm not going to be able to survive as a human being if I'm not continually amassing the gold, right? And sitting on top of it and showing it to everybody. And I think we continually tell stories that reinforce that in subtle ways. Like, I love Succession so much. I'm completely obsessed with Succession. I also reckon like and it's interesting because it's sort of telling the darkest possible version of that story. Look at these miserable billionaires, like who are just have souls that are crumpled. And yet I'm still like, oh my God, I want what Shiv's wearing, right? I want a private plane. It's like we can turn like dystopias into aspirational visions because we're looking at things through a lens of what's best, what's most exciting, what's most interesting, who's the winner. Yeah, especially with the evolution of like anti-heroes, right? Like the heroes like Tony Stark that are like, or Deadpool, or like that are just like mean rich assholes who are selfish and have very few redeeming qualities. We're like, oh, that's the best case scenario, right? I can have it all and be a dick and save the world.
Yes. Like, how rich does one have to be to stop caring about what other people think? And I suppose in our society, what that looks like in movies and TV and film and even in corporate structure is assholes. Like, if I was so rich, like if you were so rich and you didn't need anybody, would you be a nice person?
Exactly. There's ample criticism of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but end of the day, we're still lapping those stories up, right? Like, let's the Peter Pan model of like, well, who doesn't want to go to the moon or build something on Mars? And if I had all the resources in the world, what would I do? Right? It's like, it's that fantasy story writ large that even though we know it's like the source of so much fuckery in the world, we still go, yeah, but he got to build his own rocket. He's got his own version of pixie dust. It's real, guys. Story just messes us up so much is that we're like, we don't need to worry about that plot point. It'll get taken care of somehow. People that are modeling behavior, anybody who is being seen by not just girls, but boys, by being seen by impressionable humans, we really need to think about what we're modeling. Like that we're, when we say use your voice, that we're also, they see us making space for people to use their voice, right? They see us using our voice. They see us standing up for people that don't have voices. They see us owning our mistakes. They see us naming our failures, right? And naming the things that we know we do wrong, but then also claiming our wins, right? All the stuff that women and people of color and anybody who doesn't fall outside of the norm usually get criticized for, that take the hits for. So there's this dangerous stuff we have to do, right? By sticking our necks out there so we can make sure that they see it, right? Because it's, this has always been one of my It was certainly this at Disney and ever since that what we get wrong about so much girl power messaging is that it's just messaging. It's just like, be confident, be bold, be brave. It's like, what does that mean, be bold? Right? Like, if you've never experienced, if you don't know what your boldness looks like, what it feels like, then it's just empty words. And especially if girls and boys and everybody doesn't see us modeling courage and boldness and risk taking, then it starts to fall flat.
Modeling courage or boldness or risk taking, or even the assertion of being a feminist or girl power. I know you did research on young girls' relationship to claiming themselves as being a feminist. When I was running the Instagram page, I found that there were two very distinct type of teen girls, at least, on Instagram, so take that with a grain of salt. The first camp was very much reminiscent of what I grew up with the Spice Girls in the 90s and girl power, where you have your 5 different archetypes. They all like different things. They don't all like pink, but they all deserve girl power. And it's something you have to fight for. And it's something you have to commercialize at a mass scale and constantly be saying and over and really assert yourself, because it's not handed to you. The other side, especially in younger girls, was turned off when the messages about femininity or feminism was too strong or came on too strong. Almost like, of course we have this. Of course we have power. Why would you question it? To that defense, for example, if I posted, every girl is out of every guy's league, actually, the girls in the second group hated that post, because asserting your girl power doesn't mean tearing the boys down. And I always wondered, is it that they want boys to like them? Like, no, that can't be it. And even if it was, like, who cares? I don't think either of those are wrong. What the underlying message that came out of that, where I found reconciliation between those two groups, was messaging that girls don't mature faster than boys. Girls are actually punished from an early age for the same behavior that boys are allowed to indulge in well into adulthood. And that was something everybody could agree on. The issue I'm getting at here is this is explicit messaging I'm testing based off of implicit messaging that girls receive throughout different generations, 2 very different generations. Those implicit messages they were receiving about what it means to be a girl and what it means to express that power, or what it means to be a feminist. Like, that's such a dirty word to a millennial. That's how it's been conditioned to us. There's something very obvious to the younger demographic, the latter group, that was turned off by explicit messaging around being out of every guy's league or girls being better than boys, was that there was a real understanding of feminist really means. And it isn't an agenda. It isn't trying to prove anything to anyone as unnecessarily. It's a power that I saw them sit in. Did you see similar things in your research? Can you talk about that?
I mean, there are a few really interesting dynamics there. I mean, one is simply deep seeds of, what scholars often call internalized misogyny. And so the desire to keep men happy isn't just the explicit, oh, we have to please them in the very overt ways. It's that, well, the social order of society is that we are nice and we are cooperative, and our social currency requires social approval. And given that men hold all the power, that means forms of male approval. It's also the ways of sort of reinforcing approval around one's femininity, right? And one's feminine identity, because that's always positioned not as something that has its own definition, but as something that is just in relationship to masculinity. It's like, usually what we're talking about when we're talking about masculinity is what people think of as just humanity. Man is the default, right? To the extent that until relatively recently in Western culture, we just used man to refer to everything. Like, that makes things run very deep, because it's not just that if you aren't feminine, you're not a woman. It's like, if you haven't defined yourself in relationship to that, then you're not even human, right? Girls start picking that up very early when they start noticing. It's like, oh, there's a world beyond the people that are immediately around me. There's a world beyond my imagination, and it looks a certain way. And they're usually not saying this to themselves consciously, but they're saying, well, to survive in that world, I need to behave a certain way. I need to comport myself a certain way. Now, very young girls, especially girls that are raised in, you know, feminist households or raised by people who are like, giving them all the right sort of girl power messages, they will tend to have, this is one of the things that I found so fascinating in, the work with Girl Quest and the Maverick, was that they've got this organic sense, like almost natural sense of, I need to speak up for my own power because I'm super aware that this is coming, and I haven't already internalized resistance to it. What I'm doing is saying, like, of course girls should be powerful. Of course girls should be president, right? Working with girls around that first, like around the 2017 election was fascinating because they like this is terrible, right? Why wouldn't anyone want? Because they hadn't absorbed all the other messages. You start talking to girls who are a little bit older and they're cagier about it, right? They know what the girl messaging is, but they're also aware that there could be a social penalty if they're too open about it. And even if they're not consciously making those choices, it's like it's the pressure of conformity, right? And unfortunately, it's still the overwhelming pressure still skews in a certain direction. It's so many gains. Like there's so much that we can be happy about, but we still live in this extraordinarily toxic environment. We live in a world that's profoundly unfriendly to women, to non-binary people, to LGBTQIA, to people of color. Like if you are not in the sort of central norm, then you are going to experience toxicity, and you are going to internalize that experience as just the way things are. So then you couple that with a socialization that says, well, you shouldn't complain. You don't want to raise your voice too high. You don't want to be like Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris and be one of those like loud, like, annoying women, those angry women, right? It's like, even if you know that that's all bullshit, you're still like, well, it's safer for me if I keep my voice down. Life's going to be easier for me if I don't complain. I'm not going to bother anybody about the fact that I was mugged or raped because it happens to all of us, and it's just going to be more trouble for me. Right. And that all that calculus, we just do it again and again and again. And our girls see us do it again and again and again. And it keeps the cycle going, which is why I think the hardest work for us to do, but the most important work for us to do, is to start getting more comfortable with being unlikable, with being assholes, with being irritating and annoying and loud, risking our existing social currency for something that's going to serve us better in the future.
So what is that? What does that look like? What does that look like for you? What are you focused on? What are you excited about?
Say this, it sounds like a joke, but it's not really. I'm, still figuring out what I want to be when I grow up. I keep getting pulled back to girls and kids. It's where my heart is, and B, I honestly believe that it's how we change our fate in the world, really creating the landscape of possibility for girls, for kids, but I mean, especially kids that fall out, that don't see themselves in the stories, who don't get the permission to unlock the full powers of their imagination, their creativity, and their innovation. That this was actually the topic of the book I was supposed to be writing last year, was that, that this is sort of in line with stuff that you've done, that we really overlook an important barometer of where we're going as human beings when we overlook girl culture, and that really probably the best leadership lessons we could find would be in the TikTok feeds and the YA novels and, the rising pop stars, that like girls, honestly, when they're in that period where it could go either way with the dream gap and the confidence gap, when they're really fully experimenting with their power, it's like that's where we start to see what real emergent leadership looks like and what real innovation and culture hacking, looks like. So, and I would also like to build the next Club Penguin. Right? I think that every time.
Please do that. So do you feel like girls have to overshare their stories and their experiences on these TikTok feeds or on these social media platforms, like almost putting their identity as a girl out in the forefront. Like, how much do they share about their lives? Do they show the city they live in? Like, do they talk about the boys in school? Like, do you see that with young girls, that they're oversharing their personal lives for all of the internet to see?
See, that's such a good question. That's such a good question. Do they need to? No. Is there pressure to? Is there a culture dynamic where they do? Yes. Has that cultural dynamic been important to the evolution of women and girls in storytelling? It absolutely has. I mean, I left academia in part because I became interested in blogging through an academic lens, and then created one myself, and it became successful. And then everything changed. The learning for me from that, this was the reason that pulled me out of academia into it, was that I recognized when I started doing it myself that, like, this was really that personal storytelling where we lift the veil on our private lives has radical implications for how we understand the place of women and girls in the public sphere. Because for all of human history, no exaggeration, the vast 99% of our lives has been behind this veil, has been in private, and has only had commentary from the outside, usually by men. So it's always been this arena of secrecy, and it's always been this arena where we don't have agency. And so one of the things that's kept us from having agency and authority in the sense of being authors, in the sense of having power in the public sphere, is that the full force of our lived human experience hasn't been shared. So it matters that sort of the first breakthroughs of women in digital were in this personal storytelling, right? Because it was like, it's like, we can talk about this, right? We don't have to keep it a secret. We can talk about how fucking terrible childbirth can be, and how much we grapple with mental health, and how we grapple with beauty standards, and how many of us have had abortions, and all that stuff that broke so many taboos, and was really, really, really the sort of, the iron ball that broke down the Berlin Wall of keeping women from speaking their truth in the public sphere. So it matters that we have told that we have revealed our inner lives and told these private stories. And I think we need to continue to do that. I don't think we all need to feel like we need to cut our veins and bleed out on the internet for everybody in order to continue to validate our presence there. I think that especially for girls, it's this, they need to see girls, they need to see other girls being open and honest and outspoken, but they do not need to feel pressure to do it for attention. Right? And that's tough. That's really, really, really tough, because when it works, you see it's like, oh, well, this is validating. And I can say, as somebody who's like, I once did a I did a trip with Care International when I was with Disney, and I went with all these, like, there were these like Congress people and senators. We went to Uganda. Um, anyway, it was like big fancy media trip. And one of the senators, like on the second or third day, like sits down next to me, while we're waiting for something. He goes, I Googled you, and now I feel like I know way too much about you. Right. And then he just gave me this significant look. And I'm like, oh, so you either read about how I was torn stem to stern by the birth of my second child, or you read one of my multiple posts about abortion, or you read about the time I breastfed another woman's baby. And now you feel like it's just, way too much. There's value to it. It's important. I think at least some of us need to continue doing it. But I do think that we need to be very, very careful about the messages that we send each other when that becomes the thing that is, like, we don't want to over celebrate it. We want it just to be normal, like that it's okay to talk about stuff.
And not only that, given the power of algorithms and the reductionist nature in which content is served to us, whether it's TikTok or Instagram, and needing to be recognized in that first 3 seconds, or using the same sounds as everybody else, that's such a limited scope one can actually share about their lives. They're just going to give the quick hit, most punchy think that will provide shock value, or you see this homogeneous alignment of stories where everyone starts to look the same because they're making content for the same algorithm. And that doesn't show off our special uniqueness in the way that it's intended to. Sometimes it definitely does, but it's hard when you're talking about personal experiences.
Yeah, well, and it reduces everything down to those, again, to drag Aristotle back into the conversation, to algorithms driven by human measurements of small p pleasure, right? And they're not even necessarily pleasurable. It's just like what makes our eyes look, right? What makes us click? What makes us respond in these just very, very, very basic, algorithmically measurable ways. And it doesn't leave space for what is actually the human experience. Like, what is actually good for us? What is actually going to feed our spirits and our souls? What is going to be the thing that yields more human flourishing rather than just, calculating the measurements of human micro behaviors?
Such a good point. And something that I always talk about is how popular memes are actually the thing that is making them popular is the format of the meme. How easy is it to recreate your own perspective through the meme that you're looking at? Do you look at a meme and immediately want to swap out the words that are over each person and apply it to yourself in your own story or something else culturally significant that's going on? That's mimetic. Can it be built upon? What is that format? Where is it being posted? The medium is the message a lot of times. Is it Twitter? Is it Instagram? By who? And what are the interests of those audience? Such as, are they single? What do they wear? Do they look like me? We're all acting as a mirror, casting out bat signals for anyone who is ready to recognize those parts within themselves. Are they a child of immigrants? What stories and cultural experiences bind those people together? What is that perspective? It's just like a musician or a rapper putting in song lyrics about their pain and their story into digital art. Now, the difference is prior, digital art isn't valued. You post on Instagram, they use the content to exploit our data and take all the profit. So that system is broken. The ability for us as a culture to talk about pain with each other, a tool to talk about pain within ourselves, but also of society into mimetic formats. Now, the algorithm can't tell if we love or hate something. And for the most part, you spend longer on something that you hate because you're like, I can't believe I'm looking at this. So the algorithm thinks you love it and it keeps sending you more of it. And it doesn't know the difference between love or hate. So it's on the person to really say, like, do I want to be consuming this right now because I'm just going to be served more of this? And is this good for my mental health? And you're right in that it's so reductionist. And I also feel like advertising, especially digitally, is one of the things that taught us a lot about identity politics through target audiences. So some audiences are worth more based on their clicks. Like, how active is this person? Everyone is trying to figure out like who and what is most valuable, which is really dangerous because there isn't a monetary exchange between any of these things. And the concept of unity and the power of social identities to drive people's behavior and the lengths people will go to protect those. One solution that I see is, encouraging acts of reciprocity, not outward altruism. Important for non-market economies, such as, likes and eyeballs, where money and goods aren't really exchanged, that reciprocity acts as that binding mechanism. So talking about Club Penguin, going to different people's worlds, talking to each other. Reciprocity requires a response, but not necessarily like mathematically equal, like a like for a like. It's just to bond and to connect each other, not so much like expecting an immediate return. And that's the world I'd kind of like to see. People forget how US-centric a lot of the internet is. Like in other countries, email is the best way to reach people. We don't know if everything that is going to happen is going to benefit you personally. You don't know if you're going to use a tool and like, will you personally benefit for it? But we do have a duty to use a system in place to change what we don't like about it. and offer solutions. And Catherine, on that note, I just want to thank you so much for your time. And I hope people really enjoyed this episode as much as I've enjoyed this conversation. Where can people find you?
Oh my gosh. People can find me on most socials as Her Bad Mother. The blog that still exists, there's still herbadmother.com. Yeah, I'm kind of everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, still on Clubhouse occasionally, Wednesday mornings with James Andrews. We have a conversation every Wednesday morning at 8 Pacific on creator culture and Web3. And, hopefully on bookshelves near you sometime not too far away in the future.
And thank you so much for everybody listening. Please subscribe and rate this podcast 5 stars. It really helps me. And can't wait for you to hear next week's episode. Bye.